Okay, and our portion is Vayeitze, which means, and he went out, of course, referring to Jacob, Yaakov, going out to find a wife. He has to go into exile basically to make a family in order to fulfill the promise. It's a little like with Abraham. Abraham and Sarah had a promise, but there were actually some things they needed to do in the physical realm in order to conceive Isaac. And so the same situation with Jacob. If this blessing and birthright has been passed to Jacob, then he's going to have to do some things in the natural realm to bring it into balance with, of course, the spiritual blessing that was passed on to him. And so he has to go into a type of exile in order to create that family that is part of that promise. So, okay. Let's see, last night we talked about the missing 14 years of Jacob's life and the tradition that he spent it serving in the house of Eber, which gives us that root word again of avar, where we get Hebrew, and one who passes over, one who's crossed over. So we would expect if he did serve in the house of Eber, that he would have been receiving this education. It's kind of obliquely referred to in Genesis 26:5, because the rationale of choosing Abraham was because he obeyed me and kept my charge, my commandments, my statutes, and my laws. Undoubtedly, Abraham knew commandments, statutes, and laws because he lived in Mesopotamia when he started out. And those commandments, statutes, and laws are very similar to the Torah. But these would be unique ones. These would be the pure, the holy, the commandments, statutes, and laws from heaven. Who would teach those laws? We saw previously that the idea was that was probably Melchizedek, also known as Shem, and that he would have passed on this understanding, especially a pre-flood righteousness, a type of righteousness that even Enoch could walk in, even prior to the giving of the Torah at Sinai. And then this passage here suggests that the heir apparent to Shem was Eber, one of his descendants, because of the strange wording where it says also to Shem, the father of all the children of Eber. And you can see there in the genealogy that Eber is not a direct son of Shem, that he is a descendant of Shem. So that tells you that there is this spiritual connection, that there was some sort of spiritual mentorship that was likely passed on, like Moses to Joshua or Elijah to Elisha. And so there was a spiritual heritage. And the Jewish tradition tells us that instead of going to Shem, like Abraham and Isaac, that Jacob went to the house of Eber to learn and to study. Because when we look at the timeline down here, we can see that Shem would be very, 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 very old when Jacob was born. But in terms of Eber, the timelines do match up pretty well. Okay, so last night we went through this opening passage from Vayeitze, where Jacob has the dream and sees the angels ascending and descending, because our particular interest was how many times the phrase the place, hamakom, is used, because we know it has a particular reference to Mount Moriah. That's another context where the place is referred to repeatedly. And then this passage, where we see how many times it refers to the place, hamakom. And in this particular instance, it says he called the name of that place Bethel. However, previously the name of the city had been Luz, and we want to remember both of those names for later. But it was there that he made a vow He asked for garments to wear, food to eat, and then to be able to return to his father's house. That's significant. And he says, I'm setting up this pillar, I'm setting up this stone. So there's something special, not just about the ladder that he sees. There's something special about the stone, which he's going to anoint, like Mashiach, where we get the word for Messiah. And he says, this will be God's house. All right. And he says, and this is where I'll tithe. This will be the location. Let's see. We brought up the fact that even before Jacob has the dream, he has an encounter. And we can see that when we break down the Hebrew. And we want to kind of reject the English selection of translation where it says he came to a certain place. That would have been some form of the Hebrew verb bo, which is much less specific and demonstrates much less action than the actual word that's used there, which is yifga. It tells you that Jacob encountered something. Basically that he touched the boundary of something even before he goes to sleep, has the dream, wakes up and realizes what he's seen. And that was my point. When you go to Israel, sometimes you have encounters there. You know you've touched the boundary of something, but it's only in hindsight that you put it together, what you actually encountered, or you do get some sort of message that says, you know what, I need to go back and investigate that further because I kind of get it, but it's going to take another encounter for me to really piece it together. And it's hard to explain if it's never happened to you, but one day it will. It will happen because this is the pattern. So Jacob is seeing this gateway to heaven that's connecting the physical earth beneath his feet, Hamakom beneath his feet, and then Hamakom above, the heavenly world, which is part of the point of our creation. The first mention of the Makom, or the place, is in Genesis 1:9 at the creation, where it says, let the waters below the heavens be gathered into one place and let the dry land appear. All right, so what is happening here is this gathering of the waters is also the first place we're going to hear about the mikvah. It's in the verb form there, yikveu, or excuse me, yikavu. Yikavu. You're used to hearing the noun form of mikvah, which is a ritual immersion. If you've come in contact with the realm of death, if you've had an encounter with the realm of death, then you purify yourself, and mikvah are gathered waters. If you want to enter the inner precincts of the house, you immerse in a mikvah. And so the first mention of the place is also in the context of the first mention of the mikvah, the gathering of the waters. So the gathering of the water was the mikvah, and the place of the gathering is the makom, and this is where the dry land is going to appear, which is the substance. There's a picture of a mikvah on the Temple Mount, or adjacent to the Temple Mount. But our point is there was very specific dust of the earth that was used. It was from the earth that emerged from the makom, the place of the temple. You say, well, there was no temple at that time. Oh, yes, there was. There was a temple. It was not necessarily a physical temple. Remember, there is a temple that is above in the spiritual realms. And we know that the earth is created basically to reflect or to be an image, just like the upper garden and the lower garden being fed by the river of the upper garden as a reflection of what's going on in those spiritual realms. And so man is created in a very special way to be able to transcend both physical dust and spirit realm, where he can function equally well in both places, because even his physical being, the actual dirt that's being used to form him, is that the earth from the makom, it's from the place of the temple, even of the future temple. And so when we connect Moriah, Hamakom, the place, to Beit El, which is also called the house of El, or the place, that causes us to question, because we know it's probably two different places. How are those two places one place? And there's some ideas there. But ultimately, and this is what Targum Pseudo Yonatan states, is the dust that was gathered from the place where the Beit Mikdash would stand was the very dust of the first human being. And so when your heart yearns to go to Jerusalem, it's only natural. It's not just spiritual, it's also natural for you to want to go put your feet in Jerusalem, because that is our original created substance. It's the dust from Hamakom. When you're standing there, you know that you were in the original place. Okay, then last night we went through 1 Corinthians 15, and I recommend reading the whole thing in context, because it's contrasting these two people that have to be repaired, that have to be, Paul's word is changed. We have to be changed in order to be fully restored to that garden, to where we can transcend and function equally well in the physical realm as in the spiritual realm. Okay, so this will kind of bring us back on topic here to catch us up to last night. And this is a quote again from Rabbi Khan on the same topic. He says, when we return to Jerusalem, we return home in a very basic elemental sense. And I've tended to approach it in a more high spiritual sense, that there's something very spiritual going on here. And there is. But I had never, until I studied for this lesson, thought that even at the most basic elemental physical level, when we go to Jerusalem, we are also returning home. He says the very stones of the Temple Mount are of one piece with our bodies. We are part and parcel of the holy altar. And that holiest of places is intertwined with our very essence. Exile is, above all, a disconnection from the source of our spiritual identity. So we see Yaakov anointing the stone, basically setting it up as a place to return. When it's time to come home, I want to return to this stone. So I'm going to set it up as a pillar to mark Hamakom, the place. And then from there, he's going to depart. He's going to go into exile. And he must get to work on the physical activity of producing a holy marriage. He has to find a godly wife, and he needs to father godly children who can carry on this promise and who would be able to return again to that holy altar. And so that word makom is related to mekayim. And if you ever do the Hebrew liturgy from the Siddur, you've probably used this word before if you've been praying in Hebrew. But it means something that sustains. It provides existence, it provides life. So when we think of the place, especially in the case of the place, Hamakom, Jerusalem, we are talking about a place that even, not just at a spiritual level, but like we say, there's a physical connection to this place. It is a place that sustains and provides existence. In our case, it provided the very soil, the very earth from which we were formed. And, perhaps this is why Abraham says to Sarah, because remember, they had gone into exile. They had gone down to Egypt because of the famine. And he says, say you're my sister. And he says something interesting. He says that I may live because of you. So when we think of a holy marriage, as being this symbol, this picture of Hamakom, where we have this, not necessarily dual nature, but we have a spirit that is younger than the soul. Because the soil provides the physical body, the soul itself, not the soil, the soul is formed in the lower parts of the earth. So you have the soil of the body and the soul, the nephesh, appetite, emotion, desire, and intellect, which basically puts you on the level of an animal. What distinguishes you from an animal is the type of breath that he breathed into you, that spirit that was breathed into you. That distinguishes you. And you became a speaking soul. It says you became a living soul, not just a soul. An animal has a soul. A living creature is a living creature. But there was a life, there was something that made your existence different from an animal, with that younger edition of the spirit of Adonai. So Abraham says to Sarah, that I may live because of you. You know, having that bride in exile is a sign of life, that the plan is in motion. Okay, so we have an example here. Remember in the Torah, when you commit manslaughter, in other words, you killed somebody, but it was an accident, it sets up refuge cities even within the land. So you might be in the land, but it creates an exile for you even within the land. And your exile will not end until the death of the Kohen Hagadol, the high priest. That maybe suggests to us, because I've heard so many weird interpretations of the letter to the Hebrews, and much of it's dismissive or just downright twisted. But again, if he's writing to Hebrews, people who have, you know, that name of the house of Ever, those who would be schooled in these traditions, then much of Hebrews comes to life because we realize that the language is very Judaic, very first century Judaic. And it says, therefore, since we have a great high priest, and remember in context, he's talking about after the order of Melchizedek. Since we have a great high priest who has passed, and so that Greek word, you can look that up and it will give you the Hebrew cognate. The Hebrew cognate here is avar, a great high priest who has avar through the heavens, Yeshua, the Son of God. Let us hold fast our confession. So we're seeing here in Yeshua that paradigm of someone who has crossed over, someone who has passed over before us. And because he did, we can. And even though as human beings, we, for the most part, some people are privileged to live in the land, but then some people who are privileged to live in the land are not privileged to know the person of Yeshua, the Messiah. So we all suffer some sort of disconnection and exile. But the point is, even though we can be disconnected from our natural place, even though our feet may not be in Jerusalem, even though some people might be disconnected from their spiritual place, regardless, Yeshua made the sacrifice, and he has worked on our behalf, and he is continuing to work on our behalf, so that we can to avar, become a Hebrew, to pass or to cross into the heavens, which I think is a great picture. If Yaakov really was studying 14 years in the house of Ever and serving in that house, he would have come out with quite a background of knowledge and understanding that would have qualified him really to select what he wants is the most righteous woman in the world. That's what he's looking for in order to build this righteous family to return with him. And here's the thing about our perception of the place, hamakom. Depending on where you're standing, your perception of the place might be different. And that's what I've noticed with people who have been to the land, and I'm not talking about just for work purposes. Some people simply go work and come home. It's not necessarily a religious experience. But for people who have truly had the ability to experience the land to some extent, who, they knew what they were looking at. Sometimes that requires a guide to tell you exactly what you're seeing here. But depending on where you stand, your concept of Jerusalem will be different from someone else's. Someone who has never been there, never experienced it, is not going to have the same vision of Jerusalem as someone who has been there once, or someone who has been there twice, or someone who has lived there, or someone who is still living there. And that's true of any place, by the way. But I think especially of Jerusalem. So your perception of the glory changes or is different depending on where you stand in relation to Jerusalem. Basically, until you dream Yaakov's dream, you may not be able to see what Yaakov saw. And I'm going to give you an example. When we look at Isaiah, he's living in Jerusalem, all right? He's there. He's a native. He's part of the landscape. He's in the temple. And this is his vision of the glory of the throne and the altar that he sees when he's in Jerusalem. And Isaiah 6:1, it says, in the year of King Uzziah's death, I saw the Lord sitting on a throne, lofty and exalted, with the train of his robe filling the temple. Seraphim stood above him, each having 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called out to another and said, holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. Right, your vision from Jerusalem, your vision from the place is that you understand it's not only this one spot on earth that is full of the glory, but the whole earth. You see the power of the vision. The whole earth is full of his glory. But this is the difference between Isaiah and Ezekiel, because remember, Ezekiel went to the exiles, and this is from Ezekiel 3:10. Moreover, he said to me, Son of man, take into your heart all my words, which I will speak to you, and listen closely. Go to the exiles. Right? So if you're not sitting in Jerusalem right now, you're in exile. So this describes more accurately your vision. He says, go to the exiles, to the sons of your people, and speak to them and tell them whether they listen or not. Thus says the Lord God. Then the Spirit lifted me up, and I heard a great rumbling sound behind me. Blessed be the glory of the Lord in his place. All right? If you'll compare that to Micah 4:1-2, where it talks about in the days of the kingdom, the Torah will go forth from Sion and the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. In other words, the glory will go out from that place to the exiled, those who have not been able to return. Or they may return, but they're only, say, returning at the feasts. So Ezekiel's perception of the glory is how it emanates from the makom, right? It's the vision of exile. Why? Because if you don't have that strong vision of the makom, you will never return in order to have the vision of what Isaiah saw of the glory radiating outward to the whole earth. And so Yaakov is on his way into exile. He's like Ezekiel. And he's going to need this perception of Hamakom, that I've got to return to that place in order to hold on to that resolve to return to the place. If we settle for his glory is in all the earth, then it would never compel or impel us to take all this work that we're doing in the exile and remember where home is, to keep our promise to return home and to worship him and to pay tithes in that place or to bring thank offerings into that place. It helps us to focus on our job where we are, because our job where we are is to maintain our faith. In Jacob's case, to marry a righteous bride and build a righteous family. And I think we can add to that, not just to build a holy family, but to help build the family of Messiah in the exile, so that even those who are not related to us by blood become part of the family, like the idea of spiritual mentors, a spiritual father or a spiritual mother, so that when you do return from exile to Jerusalem, there is going to be a train of people following along with you who you nurtured in the faith. You didn't lose your vision in the exile. Instead, you saw the glory of the Lord in the place, which actually allowed you to function in all the earth in order to return to Jerusalem, so that once again in the kingdom, that glory could be fully extended to the whole earth. It's a matter of knowing what your job is depending on where you are. So Yaakov kind of acknowledges this special dust from which he was formed, that his very physical being is part of that house of God, that he has to return to this place to experience the glory of the place. And Paul mentions this in 1 Corinthians 6:19. He says, do you not know that your body is a temple of the Holy Spirit who is in you, whom you have from God, and that you are not your own? And that's the connection, that our very physical essence was derived from the dust of the place. Literally, our bodies are one with the place. And that's why even our natural body can be in agreement with our spiritual body that wants to return and behold the glory in the place, so that we can be messengers of that glory in all the earth. And so Adonai assures Yaakov, he says, I'm going to be with you in exile, and I'm going to help you return to your physical and spiritual source. I'm going to bring you back to the dust and the water of Mikvah Yisrael. And you guys know that phrase. That's a name of Messiah, the Mikvah Yisrael. And it's kind of a play on words with the hope, because tikva is hope. So he's not just the immersion, the purifying waters of Israel, he's also the hope of Israel's return. And so at a Jewish, in the days of Shiva, when you go and you greet a Jewish person who is mourning, this is what you say. You say, may the place, of course you would say it in Hebrew, and in Hebrew, the place is Hamakom. May Hamakom give you solace along with all those who mourn for Zion and Jerusalem. It's basically reminding the mourner of that return. And it's a comfort to know that that lost loved one, even though the body, the natural part of the person might be in a state of decay, that the spirit never decays because of its source. And so at that time when we feel most distant from the source, and that would be a time of death, we would feel most distant from the source of life. Remember, makom, mekayim, that which sustains. when we make that expression of comfort to a mourner, it's to reconnect him or her with the comfort of knowing that if both Zion and Yerushalayim will resurrect to glory, then absolutely so can your departed loved one, because they are part of that as human beings. And that's what Khan said. He says, our lives are bound up with the altar in Jerusalem, with the dust of the earth of the Temple Mount. Every death then is a destruction of the altar and the temple. And it's not just when you grieve for a loved one. Yes, it's for your loved one, but it's not just for your loved one. Some part of that altar and that temple has also been destroyed in the death. And so we grieve that, and we pray for that resurrection, because the resurrection of the righteous dead is going to be a reconstruction of the altar and the temple of our source. And that's going to help us understand when John in the book of Revelation makes a reference to the souls under the altar. He's referring to this concept that our very physical being comes from Hamakom. And it's picturing something in the heavenlies. And those souls under the altar are told to rest for a little while. And they're given robes. If you'll remember, they're each given a robe while they rest and wait. We see this too in Yaakov's vow. And remember, vows are often for marriages. But his vow involves, if you'll supply me bread and garments to wear in my exile. And these souls under the altar are in a type of exile. They've been exiled from their body. And they're awaiting a restoration to where that unity is restored, spirit, soul, body. And they're given garments to wear that basically in Jewish tradition, these garments that they wear when the soul is awaiting the resurrection, it gives them a form, but it's not their physical body. They can't have that physical body restored and changed until the actual resurrection. And again, it's all related to the temple. It's related to Jerusalem. And if you'll remember, being exiled from Eden, there were some events that accompanied that. One, they lost their clothes. And so the souls under the altar are given clothes. This is what Jacob asks for. Give me garments to wear in my exile. And remember, he's woken up from a sleep, which also represents death. And then he says, and give me bread to eat. Well, that was part of the curse of exile from Eden, is that Adam would have to produce bread with difficulty by the sweat of his brow. And then Yaakov says, and I want to return to my father's house in safety. Again, what is he talking about? I want to return to the garden. I don't want to just come back to this physical rock. I want what this rock is representing to me. I want what I'm seeing in the spiritual realm that is joined to this rock in terms of helping me understand how I will be changed at the resurrection. He's wanting to return to this particular land because of what it is joined to. And in Genesis 31:13, he says, he reminds Yaakov, he says, I am God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar, where you vowed a vow to me. And so Rashi commented to this particular verse, this denotes promotion and eminence, like one anointed to be king. Similarly, Jacob poured oil on the top of the pillar for it to be anointed as an altar. Right? So this anointing of the altar, it's like a paleo prophecy of something you're going to see later in the tabernacle and the temple as a special place that's going to represent human souls and their return and their promotion, like one anointed to be king, right? And this is what we're told. We will be basically a royal priesthood. And that's a promotion, obviously, from where most of us are today. But that's the significance. Yaakov awoke from his sleep, and that's when he realizes the wonder of Hamakom, of the place. And it's all resurrection language. The souls under the altar, they're part of this Edenic language. Jacob, just like Abraham and just like Isaac, had to experience prophecies and visions of the resurrection. Now Yaakov has to have this same vision. And in each of the patriarchs, it's presented to us a little bit differently. But again, it goes back to the altar. It always goes back to the altar for that transformation of the human soul. Now we know that Yaakov is fleeing at this point Esau, because Esau developed a grudge over not so much over the birthright, but for the blessing, obviously, because that's the loot that goes with the birthright. Esau is Edom, because you can hear in that Adam, which is red. You can hear Adamah, which is earth. And you can hear Adam, which is man. But he bears that earthy image. He doesn't have that spirit of purity from above. His nickname in Judaism is the red one, because he's at the mercy of his appetites, emotions, desires, and intellect. So he is the firstborn, the natural. Yaakov is the secondborn, the spiritual, each representing an aspect of being human. But the prophecy is that the older must serve the younger. The animal soul, the Esau, the Edom, it was created to serve the spirit, the Jacob, the spiritual man. We don't need to get rid of the soul. We need to discipline the soul to listen to the voice of the spirit. And when it does that, it can be elevated to a place so that soul can bear the image of the spiritual man, instead of bearing the image and the life force of a beast. So worshiping the image of the beast is simply to allow your Esau, your Edom, your red one, to rule your life. You are not ruled of the spirit, you are ruled of appetite, emotion, desire, and intellect. Your firstborn, your soul, is not serving your secondborn, the spirit. At Luz, which is where this vision, this dream takes place, Jacob renames it, this time Beit El. It was Luz, now it's Beit El. And the mission, remember, was going out, Vayeitze, the name of the Torah portion, to find a holy wife, to make a holy marriage, and not to imitate the Hittite marriages of Esau, his brother. Because the Hittites were really a mixed bag. It goes back to our theme here. It seems like in every Torah portion, we got people hopping back and forth. They can't make up their mind whether they want to be righteous or wicked. And the Hittites are another mixed bag of Canaanites. They were scattered over a broad area historically, from up in Assyria, Lebanon, Babylon, Egypt, all the way down to the Dead Sea and to what would have been at a later time the land of Edom. We know Abraham made friends of Hittites in Hebron. We know that David used Hittite soldiers who apparently were righteous. We know at one time they owned the cave of Machpelah, this entrance back to the garden. In a strictly physical, and I don't know why I thought you'd be interested in this, but it interested me because you wonder what people looked like. In the pictures, that have been carved into rocks or painted or whatever, the Hittites were short, they were stocky, they had dark hair, and they were white. They had lighter complexions than the people around them. They were really into sun worship. And they were very fierce warriors, which I'm sure is why they would basically hire themselves out if necessary. But they just had an ongoing feud with Egypt. At times they would make war against Egypt, and then they would make peace treaties, and then, they would intermarry. The Hittite princesses a couple of times married pharaohs. And so in any given point in history, they could be anywhere. They could be friend, foe, or somewhere in between. But definitely the concern to Isaac and Rebekah was that the two that Esau took in marriage were idolaters. So let's look at the first marriage. We have a loss of spiritual garments. And if you'll remember, we have this change of garments where Yaakov takes on Esau's garments in order to deceive Isaac. Basically, Esau gave up those clothes, and Yaakov took them because he despised those clothes. There's a whole lot to investigate right there, but I think you're getting the gist of that. The first marriage, they didn't just lose their clothes, they had difficulty in bread. They had difficulty in childbirth, and then they had exile from Hamakom. Yaakov is going to experience each of these in some way. And we're going to see even Rachel is going to not just have difficulty conceiving, but she's going to die in childbirth. And so these are the sorts of things that we might experience in exile, that we can see from the first marriage, that we might see pop up again in the lives of the patriarchs and the matriarchs, and showing us how that redemption occurs, showing that even in tribulation and difficulty, and definitely Yaakov had difficulty with bread because Lavan kept changing his wages, taking advantage of him. All right, here's just pictures where probably Beit El is. To the left is Ai, and that's how we can place Beit El because it says it was near Ai, so that's on the left. And then Beit El is over here on the right, and this is where Jeroboam built an alternate altar, and then he built another one up in Dan, till Dan. But he built two to make it more convenient, so you didn't have to do all that walking to Jerusalem. And probably you can see how this has been at some point, smoothed out for people to use. And it's likely that that altar was somewhere around here. But my question is the place, and this is obviously a subject of discussion with the rabbis. They're trying to figure out, well, if it's, this place, Beit El, then why is this Beit El? The Temple Mount, the house of God. Is that the house of God, or is that the house of God? And that's what it says. He called the name of that place Beit El. However, previously the name of the city had been Luz, which means almond tree. And if you'll remember, the menorah itself was an almond tree. It had almond buds in it that represented basically the fruit of the Spirit. And the aspect of almonds that represent eyes, by the way, because eyes are another symbol of the Holy Spirit. And so that's the question. Is the Temple Mount Beit El? Is Jerusalem Beit El, the house of God? Or was this place right here the house of God? And the answer might be yes. Right? Because I want to show you something. And I just read this, and I don't know if anybody else has ever found it. I don't remember reading a commentary on it, but it caught my interest. It's from Judges 1:8. And it's discussing the time of the tribes under Joshua when they're conquering their tribal territories. And as we read through Joshua 1, it implies that Bethel is not Moriah. It would not be the Temple Mount, because we're told that Judah had already conquered Jerusalem. It says with the edge of the sword and set the city afire. And so it suggests that it's a different place. Jerusalem is being called Jerusalem, not Bethel. But we know that Jerusalem is Bethel because it is the house of God. So it's confusing. In Judges 1:22, it says, likewise, and this is following. Remember, in 1:8, Judah conquers Jerusalem with the edge of the sword. Now, down in Judges 1:22, it says this, likewise, the house of Joseph went up against Bethel, and the Lord was with them. The house of Joseph spied out Bethel. And here we get our little explanatory expression again. Now, the name of the city formerly was Luz. So we know that this is the same place that Jacob was, because that's what was said about where he was. It was formerly Luz, but he renames it Bethel. The spies saw a man coming out of the city, and they said to him, please show us the entrance to the city, and we will treat you kindly. Now that right there is incredible. If you see a man coming out of the city, you don't have to ask where the entrance is. And in fact, any walled city of that era, you don't have to wonder where the entrance gate is. It's where the road goes. So this is just as incredible, really, of the Sodomite men not being able to find Lot's door when the angels pulled him inside the house. This is a supernatural sort of thing going on. So they say, show us the entrance to the city, that they have to already know where it is. But it's doing this for a reason. It's making us question, well, why would you ask him where the entrance was if you just saw him coming out of it? So he showed them the entrance to the city, and they struck the city with the edge of the sword. But they let the man and all his family go free. The man went into the land of the Hittites. Now here's our Hittites again. And built a city and named it Luz, which is its name to this day. So it says that they struck the city with the edge of the sword, Bethel. But this man goes out of the city, which was Luz, and now has been named Bethel. Now he leaves Bethel, and he goes and he builds a city and names it Luz. And it says it's the name to this day. Well, we're going to see if that's still its name to this day. And we're going to see if, are we really talking about two different spots here? Because in the natural realm, we would say, yes, the one place versus the other place, that Judah conquered the city of Jerusalem, and that the house of Joseph conquered the Bethel that we saw, which is not that far away, but it's not the same place. So let's break down what the Hebrew actually says, because again, we're looking for our resurrection words. It says likewise, all right? And you can see in the bold, if you can read the Hebrew, I put in bold, gam hem, all right? Also they. Likewise, the house of Joseph went up against Bethel. That's strange. Okay. Contextually, it's strange. Like who did they go up against Bethel? And the verb there, go up, Vaya'alu, it's from Olah. It means to, basically, it's a resurrection word, to go up, to resurrect. So my question is, does it mean that Joseph succeeded also in conquering a separate area known as Bethel? Or does it mean that the house of Joseph, and notice what it's not saying here, because it's talking about individual tribes in this context. how they conquered their areas. It does not say Ephraim. It does not say Manasseh. It says the house of Joseph. And using the word house is important because a house implies a family. Just like if we call it the house of Adonai. It's where the family of Adonai connects. It's where they gather. It's where they meet. And so instead of saying individual tribes, it says the house of Joseph also went up, and some unnamed man helped them locate the entrance to the city. So again, there's no reason to ask him where the entrance is unless what they were actually asking for was tactical details, like how many gates does it have? Are there triple gates? Does it make an L turn when you come in? Because that's where you can get cut down. You might actually breach the gates, but if there's that L turn, they can have archers positioned right there, and only so many people at a time can go through the gate. You can cut them down as they come through that L turn. It doesn't really say that. It just says we want to know where the entrance is. And if you keep reading, it doesn't say that the house of Joseph remained in Bethel. It just says they put people to the edge of the sword. Also, they put people to the edge of the sword. Also with who? Who went before them and put people to the edge of the sword? I'm suggesting it's referring to the mystically to Jerusalem, to Hamakom, because there's a connection mystically between Bethel and Jerusalem. Okay, and just an FYI, when you read the edge of the sword in scripture, up until the conquests of Joshua, the sword on the left is typical of what would have been used, and it would have only been sharpened on that outside of the curve. So that tells you how they fought. Basically, you could beat somebody to death with it, but more likely you were going to slice them. You were going to slice limbs, or, it's a different way of conducting war. And then after the conquest of Joshua, when you're getting into the time of the kings, like King David, the swords would have had more of the appearance of the swords on the right, where it's more of a thrusting motion. There might be a little more finesse required to learn the tactics to use the swords on the right. But when they say the edge of the sword in the time of Joshua, they would have been using something like the implement there on the left, and just that one side would have been sharp. But in the time of David, they would have sharpened two edges. They would have sharpened both sides. So they've got two edges, and then they've got the point, where you don't have the point with the earlier swords. That's just a little archaeology tip I threw in, no charge. At any rate, we've got language here that is teasing us, where it says, likewise, the house of Joseph went up. And that's that key word there. Allah, Olah, to go up, to resurrect against Bethel. And perhaps, and this is the suggestion, I don't know if I mentioned it on the recording last night, but there's rabbinic commentary trying to reconcile how the place can be here and the place can be there. One of the explanations is that Moriah was, not literally, because we're talking about changing space, but that Moriah was folded into Bethel, that basically Jacob overshot. He was supposed to stop at Moriah and pray there on the Temple Mount, where his father had been sacrificed, where his grandfather had taken him, where perhaps they had studied in the house of Shem. Perhaps Aver's house was somewhere in that vicinity, but for some reason he overshot the location. And they say that basically because Jacob overshot it, that in his dream, or maybe where it says there was an encounter, He knew something was off. Maybe he didn't know what it was at the time. Something was different. But basically, the space was folded together. And then Moriah and this point at Bethel would have been one place. And we're familiar with time travel. And we're also familiar with space manipulation. Again, the example of Lot, the people not being able to find the door, with Philip being moved from this place to that place, from being, okay, I'm right here, but then maybe space is folded and now I'm in this Ethiopian's chariot. Yeshua could be in the middle of a lake and then be on shore. It just wasn't a big deal in that realm to move from one place to the other. And I'm calling it space bending because I don't know what else to call it. But if you think of the chiasm, if you can picture the menorah and how sometimes I'll say, if you look at the menorah chiastically, just bend it on the middle, pillar, and then where these branches touch, that's where you've got things coming from the same source. And that's the essence of a chiasm. It folds the space. So they say this is what happened between the Beit El, where Jacob was, and Mount Moriah. And so when Jacob awakens, he realizes that this place is touched. He's actually been in the place without being in the place. Whether you buy that or not, I don't know. But sometimes in scripture, a reader will be told that this place was formerly such and such, but now it's something else, like Bela, which is Zoar. People will change their names at the drop of a hat. You've got the same person, the same location or vicinity, but now you've got a different name. Look how many names there are that help you understand the different aspects of Hebron. You've got Kiryat Arba, you've got Hebron, you've got Machpelah, but it's just, you know, it might be a wider area, a smaller area, a district. But my question is, because of the language, the strangeness of the house of Joseph just being inserted there and them doing something also, and you're like, also to whom? When it talks about Beit El. But I'm wondering if it's a prophecy about the ability of the house of Joseph to do as Judah had done previously. Because Judah had gained entrance to Jerusalem previously in the context. They had gained entrance to Hamakom, what would be the house. And then it just diverges into the house of Joseph, gaining entrance to this city with this mysterious man who goes off and takes his family and reestablishes a city named Luz. And I know you're wondering why I put this on here. I hope I have time to explain it. These are the Banias Falls. And this is north of the Galilee. And of course, the Galilee empties into the Yarden River. And these are headwaters. There's 4 springs in that waterfall. But it merges with water that is derived from even farther north in what is now Lebanon. So I want you to see the aerial view of these springs. Okay. You see where the red marker is. That's where the waterfall is on the map. And that's where you'll find those 4 springs. Right? And from there, it's going to run into the Galilee. And the Galilee is going to form the Yarden, which is going to run all the way to the Dead or the Salt Sea. But where I want you to go is in the upper left-hand corner of the map. See where it says Wazani? All right. Right next to Wazani is a city called Luz. All right. This is Luz. That's the Arabic. But it's just a small Lebanese village, and it's north of the Golan Heights, if you know where the Golan Heights are in Israel, and it's on the banks of the Hasbani River. And I'm not sure if that's where we're getting Bania Springs or if it's actually coming from the Greek god Pan, because sometimes they'll say Banias and sometimes Panias, because the B and the P were very close. At any rate, that village of Luz is about 1 kilometer from the Wazani Spring, which is the major source of the Hasbani River, which is a tributary of the Jordan River. So this man who leaves Bethel, he goes up into what is now, you can see it's just over the border with Lebanon. It's not far. And at that time, you know, it might have encompassed Israel, who knows. But it's there. Those are going to be sources and springs going into rivers that eventually flow down into the Galilee, go through the length of Israel down to the Dead Sea. And when you think of other things that had to happen with the Yarden, it makes a difference. So here on the left, I gave you just some geographic information about Luz and how it is the source, basically, of, it's like the very beginnings of the Jordan River. And that contribution is very important because it's the only continuous year-round flow into the Hasbani. And in fact, Lebanon and Israel have nearly gone to war when Lebanon was building like a little dam to try to control the water, because the Galilee depends on that water. It depends on that source to keep the water flowing. And if you want to start a war in the Middle East, you cut off somebody's water, right? In the West, you cut off their oil, but in the Middle East, water's the thing. And so I gave you again a Google map so you could see the actual village of Luz. And I couldn't get it to sharpen up, but at least you've got an idea of where this man went. He went to the springs that form the beginning of the Yarden. And if you decide to visit, apparently there's a Chop House restaurant the next town over. But this man who received kindness, they said, we'll show you chesed, we'll show you kindness. And if you remember what Yarden means, it means descending. When we think about the Lord himself descending from heaven with a shout, with the voice of the archangel. What Jacob saw at Luz was the angels ascending and descending on the ladder at an entrance to heaven. So was this just random information that the man leaves Bethel, which was formerly Luz, and then he goes and establishes a new city named Luz at the very beginnings of the Galilee and the Jordan River? From there, that water source is going to connect down at the southern end, just above the Dead Sea, to Jericho. And that's where the Israelites had to go in. It's where they had to cross over. Even though they had already been down in the Sin Desert, they'd been down in the territory of Judah in the 40 years in the wilderness, they had to go and cross the river Yarden because it descended. But that's where the Israelites ascended. They ascended by crossing the river which descends. And that makes us think of the rivers of Eden and how the rivers from the upper garden descended and watered the lower garden. Well, by the same token, we who are now fallen to this physical earth, we want to ascend back into our original home, into Hamakom. And this is where we have to cross over. You can go back and look at that later, but it was just the information there at the waterfall. But what was interesting to me is there were 4 springs that are the source of this waterfall. And it made me think of the 4 rivers of Eden, which tradition tells us were milk, honey, wine, and balsam. That there were 4 rivers or streams there. But anyway, from Luz, where this man goes from Bethel, the Yarden is going to flow down to Jericho, Jericho, and then from there it's going to basically empty into the Dead Sea. Now, you usually hear it translated as like Moon City, because of Yerech is another word for moon. And there was a lunar deity called Yarich, and that city worshiped that moon god. I think it might have been a goddess, but it has another meaning, and it's Reach, Yereach. And so that means fragrance in Hebrew, or fragrant. So it's interesting that, again, the fragrance, if the rivers of Eden, if one of them is balsam, it's the fragrance, and then you get the fragrance of the Temple Mount, you're still getting information, again, about the place. In fact, down below Jericho is likely where Yochanan immersed Yeshua. And then later Yochanan moved north up toward the Galilee. But remember, right around here, that's, going down into the Dead Sea. The water's not pretty down there. It's muddy and ugly and so forth, but there's prettier places up north. But it's here at this termination point. So Yeshua basically is immersed. Remember, he's the Mikveh Yisrael. He's the hope of Yisrael, that we can return to Hamakom, to the place. And so he's immersed here basically at the termination point at the Dead Sea. And then eventually he's going to complete this work in Hamakom, the place. But this particular river, again, the man took his family and built a city in Luz, where this river begins, at the house of God. It was what the place was before it was called the house of God. And he says, well, all right, I'll just move up here to the actual source of the river. What that means, we're not really sure. But it's certainly something to think about. We also know that Joseph found his wife in Egypt in exile. And it was the house of Joseph that goes up and puts Bethel to the edge of the sword, when they find the entrance to the house of God. It's just, there's more. And it says in Jeremiah 33:10, thus says the Lord, yet again, there will be heard in this place, there's our place, Hamakom, of which you say, it is a waste, without man, Adam, and without beast. That is, in the cities of Judah and in the streets of Jerusalem that are desolate, without man, Adam, and without inhabitant, Yoshev. All right, dwelling refers to when people dwell. Vayeshev is one of our Torah portions, when people dwell in the land. So it's going to be desolate, without man and without anybody to dwell in the land, without even beast. The voice of joy and the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride. Okay, none of those things are going to be in this place, Hamakom. The voice of those who say, give thanks to the Lord of hosts, for the Lord is good, his loving kindness is everlasting. And of those who bring a thank offering into the house of the Lord. Right, there's our Bethel. For I will restore the fortunes of the land as they were at first, says the Lord. Now, at this point, a normal person will read this and think, oh, the fortunes of the land as they were at first. Maybe it's talking about the time of the unified kingdom. But I say go back to the beginning of Hamakom, this place. The beginning of Hamakom, where there should have been man and beast, is the Garden of Eden. And what happens at the fall? There's no more man in the Garden of Eden. And because the beast fell too, all creation fell too, there's no more beast in the garden. There's no one to dwell there. there's not that joy of marriage that Adam and Eve had. There's no voice of bridegroom and bride. There's no joy. But he says, and there again, loving kindness. Remember them telling the man, we'll show you kindness if you show us the entrance to the house, Bethel, the house of God. But he says, this is going to be restored because they're going to bring thank offerings into Bethel, the house of the Lord, Hamakom. And it's going to be as it was at first, the way that it was designed to be in the Garden of Eden at first. So when the human beings left, the animal kingdom leaves, there's no one there to fulfill the commandment to be fruitful and multiply in the place. And ultimately, Yeshua's job with these exiles is to make a holy marriage, to make righteous offspring, and to restore that bride to the garden, so that one day joy and gladness would once again be heard there, like the passage says, as they were at first. Rabbi Nachman says that the angels Yaakov saw were going up and coming down. They were dancing. And to this day, dancing is still very much an important part of marriage ceremonies. They were dancing for Yaakov's journey to make a holy family in exile. Yeshua is making a holy family in exile. And they were dancing because of his plan to return and build a holy house on earth, to bring in offerings. He says, I'll bring my tithes here. Rabbi Helbo said, whoever enjoys the wedding meal of a bridegroom and does not help him rejoice transgresses against the 5 voices mentioned in the verse: the voice of joy, the voice of gladness, the voice of the bridegroom, the voice of the bride, and the voice of those who say, give thanks to the Lord of hosts. So do you see, it's not just about that individual marriage that they're talking about. They're talking about a return to the place where you would bring thank offerings, where you would go into Hamakom, the temple, with a voice of gladness, with a voice of joy, with the voice of the bridegroom and the voice of the bride. And he says, if you help the bridegroom to rejoice, it's as if you restored one of the ruins of Jerusalem. And so marrying a holy spouse or rejoicing with the bride and the bridegroom, they are counted as a thank offering to the temple in Jerusalem. Even in the exile, because it's considered to be the angel's ladder dance. A latter-day dance, when there is a return, when there is a restoration, when from the exile you will return to Hamakom with the voice of the bride, the voice of joy, the voice of gladness. You will bring thank offerings, and your children will come with you. And this is what the angels saw. The making of a holy family in exile that would one day return to Bethel, to the house of God, to Hamakom, and dance and offer offerings in the temple.